Congressman Ron Paul, a pleasure having you on the line, and I can't thank you enough to have an opportunity to interview you. You are now in the United States Virgin Islands, sir.
Oh, wonderful. Good to be with you today. This is Senator Redfield?
Yes, it is. Yep.
Wonderful. Well, glad you have me on your program.
Well, listen, let me get down to brass tacks. I want to talk a little bit about generally your candidacy because, you know, you have always amazed me as a Republican. And again, so many diverse views that you have. You know, it brings to me the attention the other night. I forget which debate it was. And everybody was beating their chest about military involvement here and there. And one of the most sobering things that you said is, you know, who is going to pay for all of this? And your analogy with Russia, again, the Soviet Union and their downfall, why do you think that is sinking in so much in the general population throughout the United States that this is getting awful expensive? And those that you're running against, they're in a different world.
You know, it is strange. That's a pretty pertinent question because if what you're suggesting, and which I believe, is that if they're missing the boat, first, they're not very good conservatives, and second, they're not very good at politics. Because if the spending and the debt is the crisis that we're facing more than an imminent invasion, which nobody even pretends that's going to happen, our military is not going to, be threatened in any way. We can be protected. Mm-hmm. But if this economic problems thing, it's ironic that we're supposed to be the conservatives and be concerned about it, and this is just recent history, with the Soviets collapsing for economic reasons.
Yes.
But this is historic. I mean, go and look at all the empires. This is what brings empires down.
Correct. But when you look at this thing, and like, for instance, let's bring you right to today, there is, again, this issue of Iran becoming a nuclear power, this and that. And again, President Obama's position, again, which sounds to me like you kind of lean a little bit more that way. That doesn't mean it's necessarily wrong as a Republican to think that way. How do you balance these things off? I mean, at which time do you pull the trigger and you commit U.S. troops in any conflict?
Well, when our security is threatened, and it obviously isn't.
And how do you define that? Directly threatened?
Yeah, I think so. I think not imaginary. I mean, Iraq certainly wasn't threatening. Afghanistan wasn't threatening. But I think what's going on about Obama, he's much shrewder politically. Why did McCain lose so badly, and why did Bush lose and the Republicans lose over the war? Obama came out as being the peace candidate.
Sure.
He was going to be more moderate, and yet he isn't. He's stealing the thunder. And he's going to identify with the massive number of people, because 80% of the American people think we should come home from Afghanistan right now. So he's capitalizing on this, and yet his policies are not significantly different from those that we hear on the Republican stage. And so, therefore, I think we're, self-destructing as a party if we don't change our tune.
Well, when you watch it on the stage, and again, this is what I watch, and I tend to, agree more on this particular part of the issue, and that doesn't, I guess it's fashionable for all Republicans just to be hawks. Am I correct? Is that what we're supposed to do?
Yes,
Why?
But that's not the long-term tradition. Think about the Korean War. It was Eisenhower who was the peace candidate. He wanted to end the war. Nixon was actually elected. He was supposed to end the Vietnam War. And traditionally, Republicans, the old Robert Taft wing was trying to keep us out of war.
Sure.
They didn't even want us to join NATO, and now they're declaring NATO can take us to war without congressional approval. That's how bad it's become.
Now, how do you define a strict constitutionalist? Of course, this is something that you always say, the Constitution is the Constitution. And how do you apply it today, theoretically, in modern day, where you see folks trying to twist and turn it?
Well, see, what we're challenging, if you believe in the strict interpretation of the Constitution, you're challenged to the status quo, because for 40 or 50 years, we've been taught in our schools that it should be a flexible, and we shouldn't be overly rigid. We should adapt to modern times. But they forget that the founders took that into consideration, but they didn't want you to do it quickly, and they didn't want you to ignore the Constitution, but you had to amend the Constitution. So once you start ignoring it, as we do, we become a lawless nation. I think we're there when you look at the attack on civil liberties, going to war without congressional approval, ignoring the mandates for sound money, and no authority to have a runaway welfare system. I mean, the Constitution has very little meaning today, and I think that's why we're in the mess we're in.
Well, don't you think you could also say the strict how about the strict interpretation of the Bible? That's interesting, isn't it? Versus the Constitution. I know we have a separation of church and state, but the same analogy you hear when you see the challenges to some of the writings in the Holy Bible with reference to folks that want to take it, interpret it a different way. Am I correct? Or do you want to not step into that one?
Yeah, and there's lots of room for controversy there when you talk about the historic or scientific significance versus the spiritual significance. But take something more objective, like the Ten Commandments.
Yes.
All the great religions.
Right.
Whether you're Jewish or Muslim or Christian, you basically believe in the Ten Commandments. And that is a foundation that we shouldn't compromise on.
Well, if it says on our coins, and again, in God we trust, where do you look at the issue of separation of church and state?
I think you don't want theocracies, you don't want theocrats, you don't want to try to mold personal moral behavior when it's just bad judgment rather than criminal behavior. So you can't mold people, and just like we can't mold foreign governments, by forcing ourselves with guns and bombs and invasions. You can't mold people as individuals. I mean, that's a spiritual matter, and we have to persuade people or teach our children a certain way. Foreign policy-wise, I say set a good example. Maybe somebody would want to emulate us. We can't spread American exceptionalism by dropping bombs on people and invading them. That cancels out all our exceptional values.
Well, then how do you mold morals then? We're talking about a society, and we're talking about some of the positions in the Republican Party with reference to, well, let's just stay out of the bedroom. How about that one?
Yeah, I think they should. And that's a personal moral thing. And if there's, if children are involved or forces involved, that's a different story.
Right.
But if it's a personal choice, and you and I might disagree with it, that doesn't mean that we can force our views on others, but we have a personal responsibility, we have a responsibility to our children, and we have a responsibility to our local community through our church or whatever. But to use the force of law to say, we don't think people should do certain things, I think that's embarking on their own direction.
It is, but don't you think that's a personal situation with the person and their maker? In other words, a woman, whatever the issue is, whether it's abortion or whatever, isn't that a decision a woman has to deal with when, one is knocking at the pearly gates?
I think it's all true except if you come up with dealing with another life, and that's why the abortion issue is more complex.
Okay.
If we defend the woman's right to her body and she has an 8-month pregnancy, it's pretty hard for anybody to say, "Oh, that's okay. It's her body. She can abort her 8-month pregnancy." Which technically that's the argument, which I reject that, especially as an OB doctor that had legal liability for taking care of both the fetus and the mother.
Okay, let's get to the Virgin Islands. Let me outline to you what's going on down here. We are in an economic crisis. We've got energy costs. Again, we're talking about our utility bills are running about 44 cents per kilowatt. The largest, employer in the Virgin Islands, the Hess Oil Refinery, just went out of business. 2,000 people were laying off. We've had a structural deficit in the Virgin Islands for 20 or 30 years, and we're running deficits right now with a budget just under $1 billion. We're running almost a $250 million deficit. We've got our retirement system, again, has got an unfunded liability of $1.8 billion. We are on our knees as President of the United States. If you're elected, what could you do to help the U.S. Virgin Islands?
Encourage you to quit spending, encourage you to balance your budget, encourage you to get out of debt, because whether it's a state or a territory or a foreign country like Greece, debt is the problem. Right now, we're preparing, to really back up the debt crisis in Europe. Our Federal Reserve is there, print more money, debt is the problem. So there's a responsibility at the federal level. But some of your problems, whether it's the cost of gasoline and other reasons where spending goes up and the cost goes up, that has something to do with our monetary policy. There are certainly reasons why supply and demand of oil pushes our energy prices up, but there's also the supply and demand of paper money. When the supply goes up, the value goes down, and everybody is going to be a victim to the inflation, some people more than others, like retired people suffer more. And I don't understand all the economics of the Virgin Islands, but you may well be in that circumstance suffering a greater inflation rate than we do in the States. Some states are suffering more in the Rust Belt, where they have labor costs higher than they should be. They have inflationary pressures much higher than, say, in Texas, where we are a right-to-work state.
Well, our biggest problem that we're facing, probably that's affecting the economy, is the cost of energy. We have to have a lot of redundancy in our ability to produce electricity. Again, we did have a refinery here where we had some advantages. They became uncompetitive because of the discovery of natural gas, as well as, unfortunately, with all the regulations we have, like EPA and all this kind of stuff. A lot of this refining is done in China and India, so they had to close. 2,000 jobs were lost. The government has laid off close to 1,600 people and could be laying off more. So we are now approaching and could, by July, have an unemployment rate in the Virgin Islands or in excess in St. Croix of 20%.
Wow. Well, the first thing to do, from my viewpoint on my political philosophy, is the EPA would have nothing to say about how you regulate the environment.
Thank you.
And just get the EPA out of your life. That doesn't mean that anybody has a right to pollute, the air and or water. But I'm sure people in the Virgin Islands can handle that problem, and have a more balanced approach. But the people who run the EPA have no interest in long-term economic growth. Matter of fact, some people suspect that their goal is because they end up having economic destruction. Some people suspect that maybe that's their goal. They do such a lousy job in messing around with our economy. So getting rid of all federal regulations it would be a goal that we should all seek. And some states, of course, are, you take the state of California, it regulates a lot worse than Texas, so we get a little relative benefit, but we all are under the EPA. And the founders never intended. This is where a strict interpretation of the Constitution would help us. They don't have the authority to do this.
Well, I was
unless there's an interstate conflict. I don't think you have a problem with an interstate conflict on your borders.
Well, no, but we do have to deal with trade, and we're dealing with stuff that's coming into here under a lot of things like the 14th Amendment. We're all governed by that. But when we start looking at some of these issues that you touch upon, like, for instance, the Federal Reserve, your position is to do away with them. Am I correct?
Yeah, in time.
How do you do that? And again, Treasury and these folks, the IRS. I used to always, when I would meet with them when I was a senator, I used to tell them we used to stone you in biblical times.
Yeah, and the founders, when they wrote their first Coinage Act law, they said you would get the death penalty if you counterfeited the money, and that's what we live off, is counterfeit money. The Constitution still says only gold and silver can be legal tender.
Yeah.
To close the Fed down in one day would be chaotic. So my proposal is just allow legal money to compete with the paper money.
Well, how do you define what do you define as legal money? Is that something like
the gold and silver?
Gold and silver, back with something
that we're allowed to use as legal tender. That's never been repealed. So we